Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm Jon Negroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer. And I don't usually say this, but I should mention too that I also have a lot of experience as an editor as well. That's pretty relevant. Now, on this podcast, the whole goal really is that I really want to help you out if maybe you're a beginner fantasy writer, maybe you're a barbarian, maybe you're somewhere kind of in the middle. Whatever it is, I want to provide some advice and insight into helping you craft just a story that really works, a story that pops, a story that you can be proud of. I remember the first time I wrote a fantasy novel that I genuinely looked at and was like, wow, this is something that I can't believe I made. And that pride that I felt in my creation, it was just next level. I will admit that I've had some kind of pride for everything that I've written so far, but there's nothing like writing that first novel where you feel like, wow, I can do this. I can actually make something that really punches above its weight and that can have an impact on certain people. And that's really my goal here. I also like to provide a lot of insight on traditionally publishing, but I'm also a fan of self-publishing as well. So if that's where you're at on your journey, I hope I can help you. And with that, let's take a look at today's prompt. Now, if you're new to the show, what we do here on Fantasy Writing for Barbarians is we take a look at prompts on the Fantasy Writers subreddit on reddit.com. They're curated by one of our producers, Natalia Emmons, and Natalia sends these to me sight unseen, so I actually don't know what we're going to talk about until I read the prompt for the first time live on this recording. The whole point of that is that I can give sort of off-the-cuff, live, instant feedback. And then at the end of the show, if I get anything wrong, because again, I'm kind of thinking on my feet here, if I say anything kind of confusing, or if I need to clarify anything, or if I need to be fact-checked, our other producer, Bridget Surdock, comes in and gives me some notes, and then I'll make sure everything is squeaky clean as it can be, and then we can end the show there. So all right, today's prompt, Natalia sends this to me from, I see here, username Andreas LA. I guess that's a nod to the San Andreas Fault. Which, okay, I'll just call you Andreas then. Andreas says, a couple of questions regarding a chivalrous assassin. Now that's intriguing. I just like the setup of that because that's one of my favorite things. I think I've mentioned it before. Take two things that don't really go together and put them together, and you already have something close to a story, right? Chivalrous assassin. Doesn't that just get the gears turning? You're like, ooh, how does that work? Okay, sounds good to me. Let's keep reading. I've been working on a story idea about a former Queen's Guard who trades his honor for becoming an assassin. And I say honor because I'm envisioning him coming from a kingdom that preaches honor, almost as a creed of sorts. Their queen is more so a pope-like figure, and it is part of their whole religion to be honorable. Don't stab an enemy in the back. Stay true to your word. Never strike the innocent, and all that. But while they are successful and powerful, their adherence to honor has come at a cost. Assassination isn't an idea that the Queen can subscribe to. At most, I think they would allow scouts and spies, of course, but a straight-up assassin? Anyone who would enact such a scheme or endorse it would be destined to be turned away come the afterlife. And so, this assassin guy sort of trades his honor and his place in the afterlife for the good of his realm. And I really like that idea, and the sort of moral struggle that could come with that. But more so, while I tried to think this through as much as I can, I'm now starting to wonder if this type of country could even last. If they believe in absolute honor and mercy, wouldn't they just get overrun at some point? Killed by assassins or some such? I should mention their main enemy is an empire of ruthless might, one that does not share their ideals at all. How would spycraft be viewed by such a culture? Since it is so adjacent to assassination and all, would it be better to sort of copy Ghosts of Tsushima in that this adherence to honor and SHIT differs from house to house and affects the queen most of all since she's the religious figurehead as well? Now, okay, as much as I'm tempted to just give you ideas, one thing I do want to avoid, at least on this show, is trying to basically do your homework. A lot of this is up to you, the writer. Now, I can think of all kinds of things, and I can refer back to other media and stories that can maybe give inspiration for when you run into these logic problems. And I do really love that Andreas has this stuff popping up in their mind in terms of how they're writing the story. They're actually thinking through the logical consequences and inevitable outcomes of a society they're crafting. That's awesome. And that's the thing you kind of really want to focus on. And I also really like they brought up Ghost of Tsushima. For those of you who don't know, it's a wonderful video game. The sequel is coming out next year, I think. And it is a video game for context about a samurai who it's the island of Tsushima. It's being invaded by the Mongolians, and the samurai starts to slowly over the course of the game become less and less honorable in order to repel the invaders. So as you in the game are picking up these like assassination tactics and you are starting to use smoke bombs, you're starting to basically the game kind of pushes you into that mode of gameplay where instead of just coming up to a bunch of soldiers and being like, come face me head on, the game starts incentivizing you to actually assassinate them, to throw a smoke bomb and then kill each one without doing open combat. The reason it does that is because the game gets harder and harder as you go along. And it's part of the story. The entire point of the story, the climax of the story, is that more and more the main character becomes really just starts to become at odds with the other samurai of the island. And it's a great story. And it really sticks up in my mind. I played plenty of video games and not a lot of them stay with me the way that Ghost of Tsushima did. So all that said, I really like that Andreas is using a game like this as really maybe like a stepping stone to be like, okay, so why then, and to your point, why then does a country like Japan, where honor seems to be this thing, it seems to be a code, then how come, people didn't get overrun or whatever? Well, my advice to you, because I know the answer to that question, and there are many, many paths to making sense out of this, but what I would say, my advice is read some more history. Video games are awesome. They're great for this kind of thing, but history books are going to help you out even more. Think of how George R.R. Martin bases so much of A Song of Ice and Fire around the War of the Roses. Direct references to the Lancasters, right? And the Yorks. If you can imagine what those names are in reference to. But for me, I think that a lot of the work that I did on my most recent novel, which is loosely based on the Spanish-American War, I read a bunch of textbooks about the actual war. And that gave me so many insights into how these things happen in real life, how warfare is complicated, it's messy, it has these little details to them, these little sparks that a lot of the time we overlook when we're writing our stories because to us, everything is just kind of small picture. Everything happening in the world that we're creating, it's in our minds. And so we kind of jump to conclusions in terms of course, this event is going to cause this event, and this event causes this event. And a lot of the time, things are more complicated than that. And reading history can open your mind to the possibilities. It can expand your sense of what the world can be like when different societies of different ideals clash, like an honorable society versus, in this case, a very mighty empire. So all that said, history is a big thing. Make sure that you're referencing media that you know very well. Ghost of Tsushima is a great example. A media that I like to go to a lot is The Mask of Zorro. I like to go back to these stories that I know very well because when I'm trying to use my brain to come up with stories, I try to think of why did A Knight's Tale have such an emotional impact on me as a kid? What were the things about that story, the way that it moved, the pacing of it? It's a little bit different from, like you're obviously not trying to copy the story structures of these things. What you're trying to do is you're trying to emulate the storytelling framework of things that inspire you. Because what'll end up happening is as you craft your story, it becomes your own thing. And you just have to balance that nicely. You have to make sure that it's a world that is more unique to you. And in this case, I think Andreas is developing something like that, which is great. But yeah, I would just say stories, video games, books, of course. That's the obvious one. And I'll always have to add this little extra tidbit of advice. Don't write like it's a movie or it's a TV show. Write it like it's a book. So try to avoid writing scenes that feel like a screenplay, and try to really go back to, okay, when people read a book, what are the things that they expect? So yeah, I would just say that. It sounds like you have the bones of something interesting with this chivalrous assassin thing. I think that you would do well, of course, to read more about chivalry across different cultures. A lot of us already kind of have a sense of medieval chivalry with like knights and everything, but chivalry goes back very, very far. You can find chivalry in Chinese history, and it's very different, but it has some of the similar elements you can grab from. I would also bring up Roman chivalry is very interesting, Hebrew chivalry. Think of it this way. Why would these men who, chivalry mainly applied to men in history because of, patriarchal societies. So why would these men subscribe to something like a code or a sense of honor that in some ways has these massive glaring disadvantages, and investigate that? And again, I know the answer to that question myself because I've studied it quite a bit, but I don't want to give you the answer. I want you to find the answer for yourself. I want you to look into it, and you'll probably interpret it differently than I do anyway, right? So I really appreciate this prompt. I think it's good. I just think, of course, when you do these prompts to, I know that people like to use these prompts specifically in this subreddit to brainstorm a bit, but I think that learning how to find the answers is better than people just giving you the answers, in my opinion. I think that that's going to serve you better. There's the old proverb, we all know it, teach a man to fish, all that stuff. I don't even have to say it, do I? So there you go. All right, so let's take a look at what some other folks had to say in the comments. So Pre-Jackpot said, one thought is that historically, not a lot of polities had full-time assassins. Assassination is generally a specific mission undertaken by soldiers or spies or subcontracted out. That could be the case for your kingdom too. Your character might start out as an honorable diplomat or a semi-overt spy and slowly be put in a position where circumstances force him to make more and more morally compromising choices. They have a little bit more, but I'll respond to that first before I go on. Yeah, this speaks directly to what I'm talking about. History is going to help you find this stuff. Now, I think there are some societies in history that have had full-time assassins, but I think broadly speaking, Pre-Jackpot is correct that, yeah, assassination typically is almost like a freelance job. Freelance, the term itself, relating specifically to peoples whose lands was free and all that stuff. So yeah, I think that history is just, the more you read about the past and how these things worked, it can generate a lot of ideas. Now, let's say though, you still want to do a society with full-time assassins. That works for sure. I think you'll be able to find some things. I think there are versions of that specifically in Arabic, Middle Eastern societies going way back. I could be wrong because I'm a little fuzzy on the way assassination worked. Really, I mean, pre-biblical times, but there's a lot of stuff going on there that you can refer back to for sure. But yeah, and I think the last part of what Pre-Jackpot is saying, that specifically is the Ghost of Tsushima thing, right? Of over time, having honor, but over time making these compromising choices. That's the basis of a good story. Now, my word of caution is that this is a story that's been done a lot. Ghost of Tsushima is one, obviously, as we mentioned, but there are plenty of other stories that have used honor and the deterioration of it as the basis of the story. I mentioned Song of Ice and Fire earlier, Game of Thrones, Ned Stark. I mean, that is just that story is all, not all about, but a lot of Game of Thrones, the first book, is about what happens when you just slowly lose your honor in order to play this game, and, what line do you draw for your family and all of that. And it's a very grimdark book in that sense because it doesn't have a lot of easy answers. So yeah, just make sure you're trying to find an original, fresh angle on honor so that it's not feeling like when somebody's reading this, I'm like, yeah, I feel like I've read this story before. I feel like I already kind of know what's going to happen. There aren't a lot of possibilities for an ending. I already know the character arc. So you kind of have to investigate it a little bit and maybe find something unique. Maybe find that, I almost gave you an idea, but I want to avoid that. So yeah, you could think about it. Just think about it and brainstorm and come back and the page will be ready for you. But yeah, Pre-Jackpot had more to say. Here we go. Another thought is that there's generally a wide gap between a declared set of beliefs and how things work in practice. And even one set of beliefs can be interpreted differently. One world-building trick I like is that instead of focusing on what a culture believes, think about what its internal debates are. For example, everyone might agree that honor is important, but there could be huge rifts between those who view honor as individual versus collective. Yeah, I love this. I love this way of looking at really ways to complicate and nuance your world. Wheel of Time does this really well. If you read further into that series, you get to know this kind of society called the Aiel. And the Aiel are so interesting because on the surface, they seem kind of monolithic. At first, they kind of are because in the early books, we don't know too much about the Aiel except through what people say about them and rumors. And then in, I think it's the fourth or fifth book, we really start to get to know them. We start to get to know this society and we find exactly what Pre-Jackpot is referring to here. These sort of internal debates about the kind of system of honor that they have. their dedication to being a warrior people and, what lines people draw, and they have these kind of philosophical debates. So I think that is a very smart way to look at your manuscript and to look at the world that you're creating and just ask some really probing questions. It is less about what people believe, and it's more about too, like, what people are willing to do. What are their actions? How do they put their purported beliefs into action? And that can inform a lot of things, because society tends to be very complicated. Think of America. America, on the surface, you might say monolithically, people here are all about freedom. They're all about things like kind of uniting, like patriotism and the First Amendment. But if you know anything about American politics, people differ widely on what that really means. How do you exercise free speech, for example? How do you exercise the right to bear arms? How do you exercise freedom and patriotism to your nation? You're not going to find a lot of people who agree on everything in this country of which I'm recording from. So yeah, that's just one very smart example there. So I appreciate Pre-Jackpot's advice here. I think it's really good. Voltaire, I'm not sure how to say that correctly. I'll just say Voltaire because that's a little easier. Voltaire says, "It seems like you're vastly overestimating the presence of assassins and assassinations in history, as well as spying. This is especially true for a pre-modern setting. Absolute honor and mercy, depending on how you cash that out, could be a major problem in terms of decisions made in field combat, choices made around hostages and ransoms. But stuff around spying and assassination won't be a problem unless you decide it should be." Yeah, and I think my only thing with this is that this is fantasy, right? And I understand Voltaire's point. It's a good point, which is that, yeah, you're going to find in a lot of history that really, like, the idea of honor, it typically tends to be something that is preached, but not always followed. But yeah, I think it's okay, though, to stretch your imagination and ask what-if questions, because your fantasy can be different from reality. It just depends on how you execute it. And you just have to find good reasons for why assassinations and spying might be so relevant. Think of the show Spy Family, a wonderful anime, and an anime that really is all about spying and assassins. Like, two of the three main characters are a spy and assassin respectively, and the way that they differ, the way that they carry things out, the world that they exist in, which is sort of a Cold War, post-World War II sort of setting in the 1960s equivalent of this world. The world they exist in needs spies and assassins, and the manga/anime does such a great job of explaining why they're so needed. And the world is different from ours enough so that it feels, even though it still feels pretty familiar, you can watch it and be like, oh, cool, yeah, it's like the 1960s, but the Japanese spin, I guess. But at the same time, there are enough differences, there are enough world-building quirks to it that you totally buy and can immerse yourself into this idea that there are tons of assassins and spies running around, especially because there are times in histories where, in the specific history of the Cold War, where, yeah, there were a lot of spies. Obviously, the anime is exaggerating, it's embellishing quite a bit, but it's okay because it's fantasy and we're not expecting it to be realistic or anything. So yeah, I would just say it's okay to, try to envision a different world from ours and to stretch history a bit. History should just be kind of a basis. It should be a reference point. It should be something to help keep you grounded. But it doesn't have to be the end-all, be-all. You don't have to avoid writing a story like the one you want to write just because it doesn't condone or doesn't coincide perfectly with historical precedent. You just don't have to worry about that, in my opinion. That said, you are sort of setting a standard for yourself if you are going to, use some history but push things. People are going to hold you to a certain standard, and so you have to be ready for that. You have to do the work and work really hard to get it right, and that's okay, because if you do that, then you are going to earn a lot of respect. You're going to earn a lot of credit and goodwill from your readers who are going to be happy that you wrote the novel that you wrote. All right, so some good comments here. I think this was a fun one, and I really love just this idea that Andreas is kind of cooking up. I hope that they're able to produce a really great draft, a really great manuscript in general from this, and wish them all the best. So for now, I'm going to turn it over to our fact checker and clarifier, Bridget Surdock, our wonderful producer, Bridget Surdock, who's going to give me any and needed notes on what we just talked about. And then after that, I'll be back to, finish this out. All right, I am back, and I have my notes from producer Bridget on this episode. Here's what Bridget had to say after listening through. Okay, Bridget says, Ghost of Yote is indeed set for a 2025 release date, which is so incredibly vague. Yeah, I didn't mention this, but the sequel to the video game Ghost of Tsushima, which I mentioned, is called Ghost of Yotei. I think Yotei is in Hokkaido, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, instead of Ghost of Tsushima 2, they changed location. Makes sense if you played the game. Bridget also said, I highly agree that history books and learning history of real-world societies and people will help solve this issue of how to make it make sense. I would also add that in addition to just looking at, quote, honorable societies, end quote, they look into the papacy. If the queen, who this Queen's Guard would likely know, is a religious figure on par with the Pope, look into the history of the Pope. Look at some of the crazier stories within Catholic history. There was a Pope accused of homicide and perjury. There's the Avignon papacy and all the nonsense that came with that. Yeah, definitely. There's the Borgias. There's all kinds of things. I didn't mention this before, but a thought that did cross my mind when I first read that prompt was because there was honor, assassin, and the word creed. I was very much thinking of Assassin's Creed. Not going to lie, another video game. Very similar to Ghost of Tsushima, the kind of the precursor to Ghost of Tsushima, even though it's a different studio. Regardless, yeah, Assassin's Creed also is this take on real-world history events. It uses a lot of real-world history, but it adds this fantastical society of assassins, and it's not too dissimilar at all, actually, from what Andreas, the original poster, is apparently trying to do with their novel, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, there's all kinds of real-world stuff you can find with Catholicism, for sure, especially around the Renaissance, but also going as far back as the Crusades. Bridget said, or even go beyond Catholicism, look into other religious leaders and theocracies. Figuring out how the Queen and the kingdom as a whole work could help solve the problem too, or whatever other logic problems you come across. I like this advice just because, yeah, I guess to be fair, people are pretty familiar with the sort of Western history and how a lot of that stuff. But there's so much other history that's not quite as mainstream or normalized that you could dig into. You could find all kinds of religious theocracies. So theocracy as in a government controlled by the religion. You could find stuff like that all over, like the ancient history of the Russians, ancient history of the Turkish. There's all kinds of things that are a little bit outside of the norm that you could draw from that would be a little bit fresher, to be sure. Bridget even mentioned here the Dalai Lama, ancient Egypt, Saudi Arabia, yeah. Also, the first two things I thought of, especially after OP mentioned the Queen being a religious figure, are Priory of the Orange Tree and Warrior Nun. Priory in that Sabran is seen as a religious figure and has to act as such, but that religion is a false history and actively damages her kingdom and herself. Warrior Nun in that the group of nuns who do this espionage, fighting demon stuff, is kept separate from a lot of the church as a whole. For a good chunk of the show, the Pope doesn't really even know what they do. Yeah, I haven't seen Warrior Nun. I wonder if I should check that out. Sounds interesting. I know I've seen the thumbnail on Netflix a bunch, and hey, compared to Chivalrous Assassin, that's another kind of fun, two words that don't normally go together, but when you put those words together, Warrior and Nun, it's oh, I want to know more. You talking about using the things you like to emulate in your stories is reminding me of another Tumblr post, searching for it now. I can't find it. I am big upset about it. Sorry, Bridget. Maybe they'll find it later. But it was something to the effect of, quote, your art style equals your influences plus your habits. And that feels like it applies to the way you develop your writing style as well. You take things you like from the way other authors write and envelop it into your own methods and habits, and suddenly you have something all your own. Yeah, absolutely. I struggle with this a little bit sometimes because I don't want people to hear me say that and be like, okay, great. I'm going to take Avatar The Last Airbender and I'm just going to do that, but maybe with a few changing of proper nouns. You do have to be careful about that because if you borrow too liberally from the things you like, it can so easily go from being a polite homage or a tribute to actually being a little bit more than a ripoff. It's such a fine line, and you have to draw your own line in a certain spot, but it's a good starting place. You just have to be wary of, how original you're being. You saying polities launched me immediately into a song from Epic the Musical, which if you haven't listened to, will mean nothing to you, but to me it's everything. Yeah, polities is not usually a word I use. I kept wanting to say polite societies, and that was a tricky one. Bridget said, I'd imagine there are societies that have full-time assassins, but all the examples I'm finding are specific to time-specific time periods. Wonderful, Bridget. They formed with a specific goal in mind and then disbanded once that goal was acquired. That's pretty interesting. See, Andreas, this is the kind of stuff you can find. There you go. The debate advice is great. It slaps. I felt like I've been waiting for you to bring up Spy Family since this began. Yes, I too have thought about Spy Family a few times and I've held back a little bit. I want to make sure if I'm talking about Spy Family, it's relevant because that's just such a wonderful show and such a wonderful reference point. If you have not watched Spy Family or read the manga, highly, highly recommend. It's very good. Oh, Bridget did find what they were referring to, the Tumblr post. Your influences plus what you enjoy doing plus your specific brand of laziness equals your art style. That's such a wonderful equation. I really like that. For me, my influences are all over the place. I have so many. I mean, animation, obviously. A lot of people know me from like the Pixar theory and things like that. But also anime for sure, One Piece. I mean, there are all kinds of things have influenced me over the years. What you enjoy doing. For me, I love playing pickleball. I love going for runs. I love the outside. I like being outside and doing things. And I like being alone very much. I'm a very introverted person. Plus, your specific brand of laziness. My laziness? My laziness tends to be complicated because for me, laziness can mean I do something, but not what I'm supposed to be doing. I basically took at something, I'm like, I'm going to do that tomorrow, and today I'm going to do what I want to do. And that equals my art style. Sure, I think that tracks. And Bridget did mention that they don't have the original source for what they just shared, but unfortunately. But it is definitely from Tumblr, as all things tend to be. All right, thank you so much, Bridget, for sharing the notes, making sure we have these fact checks in line and clarifications as needed. Thanks so much for listening to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. We'll be back soon. If you have your own prompt or you have something you want to share with me, if you have any requests for advice, whatever, there are two ways to get in touch. You can email me. The email is in the show notes. It's fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com. Or you can join the Discord. It's the In Between Drafts Discord, which is our host website. And we have a Fantasy Writing for Barbarians channel there. Hope to see you in the community. And thank you so much for listening once again. With that, my advice to you, keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.